Hi folks, thank you for stopping by. If you found this video useful, please drop a like and consider subscribing. Also, I would love to know where you all are watching from. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Today we are starting off with the murder of Stacy Mitchell, Oregon, USA, 1980s. Portland, Oregon, in the early 1980s, was a city of quiet neighborhoods, tree-lined streets, and an unassuming rhythm of everyday life. Stacy Mitchell, a 12-year-old girl, lived within this ordinary environment, moving between home, school, and the familiar streets she had known since childhood. Her life was typical of a young girl in a suburban community: schoolwork, friends, and the routines that gave structure to daily existence. Stacy was described by friends and family as bright, adventurous, and spirited. She loved being outdoors, riding her bike, and spending time with her younger siblings. On the day she disappeared, Stacy left her home for an afternoon walk, a journey she had made countless times before. But that afternoon, the normal patterns of her life were disrupted in a sudden and irreversible way. Her disappearance was noticed quickly. Friends expected to see her return, but when she did not appear, concern grew, and family members began searching nearby streets and areas. Law enforcement was called in, and a search began that extended through local neighborhoods, wooded areas, and streets she frequented. Despite the effort, no immediate sign of Stacy could be found, and the community became aware that something terrible had occurred. Investigators examined the circumstances of her disappearance, piecing together timelines, witness accounts, and any potential leads. The case remained complex, with few concrete clues initially available. Authorities explored the possibility of abduction, interviewing residents and individuals in the area to understand whether Stacy had been seen with anyone or if suspicious activity had been reported. Over time, evidence emerged that confirmed Stacy had been murdered. The investigation revealed the perpetrator's calculated actions, targeting a child in a seemingly safe environment. Details of the crime exposed a level of planning and predation that shocked the community, highlighting the vulnerability of children in ordinary suburban spaces. The legal process that followed documented the evidence, forensic findings, and witness statements that ultimately contributed to identifying a suspect. Court proceedings examined the sequence of events, reconstructing the circumstances of Stacy's final hours and the actions that led to her death. The case emphasized both the premeditated nature of the crime and the challenges of investigating incidents involving young victims. Stacy Mitchell's family experienced profound grief. Friends, neighbors, and the wider community mourned her loss, remembering her as a playful, intelligent, and lively child. Vigils and memorials were held, honoring her life and the moments she had shared with those closest to her. The memory of her personality, the curiosity, energy, and joy she brought to everyday interactions, remained vivid in the minds of those who knew her. The environment around her home and school, once ordinary and secure, became entwined with the narrative of her abduction and murder. Portland, its streets and neighborhoods carried the mark of a violent intrusion into normal life, leaving residents with a lingering awareness of vulnerability in spaces previously considered safe. Stacy's story, though set decades ago, influenced conversations about child safety, abduction risks, and community vigilance. The case remained a reference point for law enforcement, educators, and parents seeking to understand how such tragedies occur and how ordinary routines can be disrupted by violence. Her life, full of potential and everyday joys, is preserved through the memories of family, friends, and community members who continue to honor her presence and the child she was. Next story: the murder of Michelle, California, USA, 2008. Santa Ana, California, is a city where suburban streets intersect with the bustle of daily life, where homes sit close together and neighbors often know one another by sight, if not by name. In September 2008, Michelle Liu, a 23-year-old university student and aspiring professional, was preparing for the start of a new semester. She had plans, ambitions, and a life shaped by both routine and opportunity. moving confidently through her world with the optimism typical of someone her age. Michelle was known for her intelligence, discipline, and focus. Friends described her as driven yet approachable, someone who balanced academic rigor with social connections. On the evening of September 29th, she was walking home from a study session, following streets she had traversed countless times, believing herself safe in the familiarity of her neighborhood. Her disappearance shocked the community. Witnesses later reported seeing her in the vicinity of her apartment complex, but she never returned home. Local police responded immediately, searching streets, checking surveillance cameras, and canvassing the area for any sign of her. Each lead was scrutinized, from fleeting sightings to cars parked near the neighborhood, as investigators tried to reconstruct the timeline of her final movements. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Michelle had been targeted. The perpetrator had stalked her, observing routines and patterns in a calculated manner. The abduction was not random. It was deliberate, executed by someone who had studied her movements and exploited trust in order to commit the crime. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, tracing evidence and interviewing acquaintances and neighbors. Forensic teams examined physical traces, and digital records were reviewed to establish connections that would eventually lead to the suspect. The process was methodical, balancing the urgency of locating a young woman with the careful analysis required to build a case capable of standing in court. Michelle's body was discovered later, confirming the worst fears of her family and friends. The details revealed a violent, deliberate act that left the community in shock. Her family and close friends were thrust into a grief that was compounded by the senselessness of the crime and the breach of security in a space she had believed to be safe. The legal proceedings that followed documented the sequence of events, the identification of the perpetrator, and the circumstances surrounding the murder. Court testimony, forensic evidence, and reconstructions of Michelle's final hours painted a picture of premeditation, highlighting the chilling method with which the crime was carried out. Michelle's life, defined by her studies, ambitions, and relationships, was abruptly ended. Friends and family remembered her energy, her intelligence, and her dedication, preserving the memory of who she had been in the time before the crime. Community members mourned her loss, holding vigils, organizing memorials, and speaking openly about the tragedy that had touched their city. The streets and apartment complex in Santa Ana became a reminder of the vulnerability that can exist even in ordinary spaces. Michelle Lee's story drew attention to personal safety, awareness, and the importance of understanding the warning signs of targeted violence. Her life, though cut short, was commemorated through the memory of her personality, her achievements, and the connections she had forged in the community. The case left an enduring mark on Santa Ana. Law enforcement, the legal system, and community members reflected on the circumstances of her death, the perpetrator's planning, and the need for vigilance. Michelle's story, her routines, and the ordinary environment in which she was taken remain part of the collective memory of the city, marking a time when normal life collided with violent intent. Next story, the disappearance of Maureen Brain, UK, 1970s. The 1970s in the United Kingdom were a time of social change, quiet streets, and communities that often felt insulated from the dangers reported elsewhere. In this environment, Maureen Brain, a young woman in her early 20s, moved through her life with the ordinary rhythms of work, friends, and family. She lived in a small town where neighbors knew one another and routines were predictable, a place where the disappearance of someone familiar would ripple through the community with profound shock. Maureen was known as approachable, kind, and active in her local circles. Friends remembered her for her warmth, her humor, and the steady presence she brought to everyday interactions. On the day she vanished, Maureen was engaged in ordinary activities, running errands, socializing briefly, and following patterns that had always felt safe. But one moment, one decision, would alter the course of events and cast a shadow over the community she inhabited. When Maureen failed to return home as expected, concerns spread quickly. Family members and friends began searching the nearby streets, reaching out to acquaintances and contacting local authorities. Law enforcement responded by canvassing the area, gathering statements, and attempting to trace her last known movements. The absence of immediate clues created a tension that gripped the town, as neighbors struggled to understand how someone could vanish without a trace in familiar surroundings. Investigators explored a range of possibilities: voluntary disappearance, misadventure, or foul play. Each lead was pursued, though details remained scarce. Witnesses offered fragmentary information, passing observations, brief encounters, or sightings that might or might not have been connected. The limits of communication technology at the time made coordination difficult, prolonging the search and heightening uncertainty. As days passed, the lack of resolution intensified the concern. Posters were placed, local media reported the disappearance, and family members spoke publicly in the hope of generating leads. The community mobilized, organizing searches through parks, streets, and surrounding areas, driven by the urgency of locating someone so familiar yet suddenly missing. The investigation, though thorough, encountered obstacles typical of the era: limited forensic capabilities, absence of digital records, and reliance on witness memory. Each avenue explored offered hints, but no conclusive evidence emerged, leaving Maureen's fate unresolved. Law enforcement maintained contact with family members, revisiting old leads and following new tips as they came, but the story of her disappearance remained fragmentary. Maureen Brain's absence transformed the perception of safety in her town. Streets, local businesses, and social spaces, places once associated with routine and familiarity, were now tied to the uncertainty of her vanishing. Families reconsidered daily habits, and neighbors remained vigilant, aware that ordinary environments could harbor hidden dangers. Despite decades passing, the community and her loved ones continued to remember Maureen for who she was rather than the circumstances of her disappearance. Friends recalled her laughter, the way she carried herself, and the interactions that made her part of the fabric of daily life. Memorials, anecdotes, and public records preserve the memory of her presence, creating a portrait of a young woman whose life was abruptly obscured by mystery. Maureen Brain's disappearance remains part of the tapestry of unsolved cases in the UK, emblematic of the enduring questions that follow someone vanishing without explanation. Her life, though interrupted, is remembered through the voices of those who knew her, and her story continues to resonate with the quiet tension of a town confronting the unknown. Next story: the murder of Immerse St. Gian, New York, USA, 2006. New York City, a metropolis of endless movement, neon lights, and constant noise, carries its own rhythm of risk and opportunity. On the night of February 24th, 2006, Immerse St. Gian, a 24-year-old graduate student and aspiring professional, left a nightclub in Manhattan. She was a woman known for her intelligence, ambition, and charisma, moving through the city with the same confidence and independence that characterized her life. Immerse had completed her studies in criminal justice and worked at a law firm, balancing career aspirations with a vibrant social life. Friends described her as determined, energetic, and deeply committed to personal growth. That night, she left the club, intending to return to her apartment after an evening out with friends, unaware that her journey home would become a harrowing chapter in the city's history. She was seen entering an elevator in the vicinity of the bar, a final step before disappearing from the public eye. Moments later, the ordinary evening transformed into tragedy. Law enforcement was alerted when Immerse failed to return home, and initial investigations focused on the streets, surveillance footage, and possible witnesses who might have seen her last movements. The case quickly drew attention because of the violent and deliberate nature of the crime. Investigators discovered that Immerse had been abducted, assaulted, and ultimately killed by an individual known to have a criminal history. The details of the crime exposed a level of premeditation and opportunism, illustrating the dangers that can exist even in a city filled with people, lights, and supposed security. Police combed through the city's networks, reviewing building security systems, interviewing potential witnesses, and tracing the suspect's movements. Forensic evidence became central to establishing a link between the perpetrator and Immerse, including DNA material and other traces collected from the scene. The painstaking process revealed the calculated steps taken by the assailant, offering clarity about the chain of events that had led to her death. The arrest of the suspect brought the investigation into sharp focus. He was a nightclub doorman with a criminal record, whose actions had turned an ordinary night out into a fatal encounter. Legal proceedings followed, examining the premeditated nature of the attack, the evidence gathered, and the sequence of events that led to the crime. The trial was closely watched by the public and media, highlighting both the vulnerability of individuals in urban spaces and the capacity for meticulous investigation to bring clarity to complex cases. Immette's family endured a profound sense of loss, compounded by the violent circumstances of her death. Friends and colleagues remembered her intelligence, ambition, and warmth, sharing stories that emphasized her vitality and the life she had been building. Memorials and public vigils honored her memory, focusing on the qualities that defined her rather than the violence that ended her life. Her case prompted broader discussions about safety, workplace screening, and urban security measures, influencing how establishments monitored employees and how patrons navigated nightlife environments. Immette's story also underscored the need for vigilance and community awareness, showing how ordinary routines can intersect tragically with criminal intent. Imette St. Guillen's life was abruptly taken, but the investigation, trial, and public memory ensured that her presence remained visible. Her contributions, ambitions, and personality continued to resonate with family, friends, and the broader New York community, leaving a record of a young woman whose life and potential were cut short in an otherwise ordinary night. Next story: the murder of Laci Peterson, a quiet night in California. Night falls differently in the suburbs of Modesto, California. It isn't the deep, endless darkness of the desert or the buzzing neon of a city skyline. It is the soft hush of residential streets, the low hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, or creak of a swinging gate. It was here on December 24th, 2002, that Laci Peterson's story would begin and end in ways no one could have anticipated. Laci was a young woman, 27 years old, with a life full of quiet promise. Married to Scott Peterson, she was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a boy they had planned to name Connor. Friends described her as radiant, warm, and full of life, the kind of person whose presence could brighten a room without effort. That winter, the streets of Modesto carried the soft chill of December nights, and Laci's absence would soon be felt in a way that shook the entire community. On Christmas Eve, Laci left her home, telling her husband she was going out for a walk. It was a short stroll, a brief escape from the warmth of the house, a moment alone with her thoughts. But she never returned. The house remained quiet, too quiet, as hours passed and Laci's presence remained absent. Scott reported her missing later that evening, painting a picture of concern and unease. The local police began a routine investigation, tracing her steps, speaking to neighbors, and scouring the small suburban neighborhood for any sign of the young woman. The first days were tense, filled with hope and dread in equal measure. Flyers were distributed. Local television stations broadcast pleas for information, and volunteers combed through the streets. The community held its collective breath, praying for a safe return. But as the hours stretched into days, fear began to creep in. Something was wrong. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing person to a potential crime. Laci's husband, Scott, became the focus of police attention. His demeanor, casual at times and oddly distant at others, raised questions. He claimed ignorance of her whereabouts, insisting he had no idea what had happened to the woman he claimed to love. Yet inconsistencies began to emerge. Statements changed, stories didn't align, and the unease surrounding Scott grew heavier with each passing day. Then, on December 24th, just after the holiday, a fisherman discovered a small, eerie sight along the shores of the San Francisco Bay: the body of a woman. Lacey's body, now lifeless, had been carried into the waters, hidden beneath the shifting tides, but not concealed enough to escape notice entirely. Not far from her, the body of her unborn son, Connor, was later recovered, the smallest life extinguished alongside his mother's. The news hit the community with the force of tidal wave. What had been a nightmare of disappearance now became a horror of murder. The trial that followed was meticulous, intense, and gripping. Evidence was gathered with painstaking care. Forensic analyses of the bodies, fibers, tire tracks, and boat rentals. Investigators uncovered Scott's affair, his financial troubles, and a pattern of lies that only strengthened the suspicion that he had orchestrated the tragedy. The prosecution built a case not on speculation, but on the quiet, undeniable truth revealed by painstaking police work. Throughout the months of investigation, media attention was relentless. Lacey's story, the young mother whose life had been stolen so cruelly, became a national narrative. The public followed every detail, dissecting each revelation, imagining the final moments she endured. While the media could sometimes sensationalize, the core of the story remained a quiet, persistent sorrow. A life ended too soon, a child never born, and the ripples of pain sent through a community and a nation. Scott Peterson's trial culminated in a verdict in 2004. He was found guilty of first-degree murder for Lacey and second-degree murder for their unborn son, Connor. The courtroom, once a place of procedural formality, became a stage for justice, the echo of loss lingering in every whispered testimony and subdued sob. The sentence, death, justice, as the law determined, had been served, though the emotional void left behind could never be filled. Even after the verdict, the story of Lacey Peterson remains haunting. It is not merely the facts, the dates, and the verdicts, but the quiet moments, the ordinary nights that ended in tragedy, the walks along a suburban street that became the last anyone would see her. It is the haunting idea that beneath the calm of everyday life, darkness can intrude with sudden, irreversible force. Modesto continues, the seasons turn, and the neighborhood streets see the passage of new lives, families, and quiet evenings. But those who remember Lacey Peterson carry a sense of unease that lingers in the back of the mind. She is remembered not just for the tragic circumstances of her death, but for the life she lived. The small, luminous moments that made her presence so vivid, so painfully human, and so heartbreakingly missed. As night settles over California, it does so with a different weight for those who knew Lacey and those who learn her story. The streets sleep, the wind whispers through the trees, and somewhere in the darkness, her memory persists. It is a quiet echo, a reminder that life can be fragile, and that even amidst the ordinary rhythm of daily existence, tragedy can strike with an unforgiving and irrevocable finality. In the end, Lacey Peterson's story is both a warning and a testament. It is a story of love and loss, of hope turned to grief, and of justice pursued through meticulous, unwavering effort. And while the world continues its endless rotation, her memory, like a soft, persistent wind through the streets of Modesto, remains quietly insistent, impossible to forget. Next story, the disappearance of Jennifer Kess, Florida, USA, 2006. The night in Orlando, Florida, is heavy with humidity. It drapes over the city like a slow, sticky curtain, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, and the whisper of palm trees swaying in the warm breeze. In the quiet hours of January 24th, 2006, a young woman named Jennifer Kess vanished from this ordinary suburban landscape. The circumstances of her disappearance would confound investigators for years, leaving a lingering sense of unease that still whispers through the streets where she lived. Jennifer Kess was 24, bright, and full of promise. She worked as a financial analyst, a careful, precise mind navigating numbers and spreadsheets by day, and a life of modest routines by night. Friends described her as thoughtful, meticulous, and cautious, The kind of person who planned her days down to the smallest detail. Her apartment, in the Sand Lake neighborhood, reflected this quiet order, neat, clean, and deliberately arranged. On the morning of January 24th, Jennifer left for work as usual. She was last seen leaving her apartment around 8 a.m., wearing a professional ensemble, carrying her laptop bag, and stepping into the early Florida morning with the ease of habitual routine. Her co-workers noted her arrival, or rather, the absence of it. By mid-morning, Jennifer had failed to appear at the office. Calls to her cell phone went unanswered. Texts remained unopened. The first hints that something was wrong began to seep into the daily rhythm of her friends and colleagues. That afternoon, concern grew. Jennifer's car, a silver Pontiac Grand AM, remained in the parking garage of her apartment complex. The vehicle was unlocked, personal items still inside. Her purse, her keys, her laptop. Nothing seemed taken. Nothing suggested a struggle. And yet, Jennifer Kess was gone. This was not the action of someone leaving voluntarily. Something had interrupted the quiet cadence of her life. The police were called. Officers began a systematic investigation, canvassing the apartment complex, questioning neighbors, and reviewing surveillance footage. Yet the trail was frustratingly thin. Cameras caught glimpses of her leaving the building that morning, but there was no record of anyone following her, no obvious suspect, no explanation for her sudden disappearance. Theories began to form, quietly at first, then more urgently. Robbery gone wrong, stalker, stranger abduction. But every avenue seemed to close in on itself. Days turned into weeks, and the community's anxiety deepened. Flyers went up, local media covered the story, and volunteers searched the streets and surrounding areas. The story of Jennifer Kess became a quiet obsession for those following it. Neighbors who had passed her in the hallways, coworkers who had shared brief conversations, friends who knew her gentle smile. Everyone wondered what had happened in the spaces between her apartment and the unknown place she had vanished to. Investigators considered every possible lead. Anonymous tips flooded in, some credible, some not. Searches were conducted at lakes, in wooded areas, in abandoned buildings, and along streets where she might have walked. Each effort yielded nothing but the lingering fear that something unseen had slipped past the notice of everyone. There was no ransom note, no message, no trace. It was as if Jennifer Kess had been erased from the world without a sound. As years passed, the case grew colder. New investigative techniques were applied, old evidence re-examined. Detectives interviewed hundreds of individuals, followed up on leads that ranged from mundane to chilling. Still, the core mystery remained. There was no motive, no suspect, no resolution. Her disappearance became one of those rare, unnerving stories that leave an empty space in memory. A life that seemed ordinary, yet was interrupted by an extraordinary and inexplicable darkness. Her family endured in quiet despair. Every birthday, every holiday, every anniversary of her disappearance was marked not by celebration, but by a reminder of absence. Jennifer's parents, siblings, and friends waited, hoping for closure, clinging to the smallest fragments of information that might indicate she was alive, or at the very least, that the truth might eventually surface. The slow, grinding passage of time only deepened the sense of helplessness, leaving the memory of Jennifer Kess suspended between reality and the unknown. Even now, the streets of Orlando carry the echo of that cold January morning. The apartment complex stands, palm trees still sway. The hum of distant traffic continues. But in the quiet of night, for those who knew her or have followed her story, there's a lingering tension. It is the feeling that someone walked out into the morning and then simply vanished, leaving no clues, no answers, no peace. The disappearance of Jennifer Kess is a quiet, haunting story. It is not filled with dramatic chase sequences or sudden confessions. Instead, it lives in the small details. The unanswered phone calls, the empty parking space, the life that simply ended or changed without explanation. It is a story of absence, of uncertainty, and of the unsettling thought that sometimes, even in a world that feels familiar and safe, darkness can enter quietly, invisibly, and without warning. As night descends on a neighborhood where Jennifer once lived, it does so with a weight that ordinary evenings rarely carry. The air is warm. The lights flicker in apartment windows, and somewhere, in the quiet spaces between palm trees and pavement, her presence is remembered only as the memory of a life interrupted. The mystery remains, unresolved, a quiet, persistent ache for those who wait for answers that may never come. In the stillness of the night, one can imagine her steps, her laughter, her careful routine, all vanished without trace. And yet, her story endures. It is a reminder that even the most ordinary life can intersect with incomprehensible mystery, leaving behind only questions, speculation, and the quiet, heavy silence of absence. Next story: the murder of Betsy Aardsma, Pennsylvania, USA, 1969. The autumn air in State College, Pennsylvania, carries a chill that seeps into the bones, even in the bright light of day. Trees line the campus of Pennsylvania State University, their leaves turning gold and red, and the quiet rustle of the wind blends with the soft hum of students moving between buildings. On November 28, 1969, this calm was shattered in the most sudden, inexplicable way. Betsy Aardsma, a 22-year-old graduate student, entered the library for a brief study session, and she would never leave. Betsy had come to Penn State after a life marked by curiosity and ambition. A bright, introspective student, she had excelled in literature and history, balancing academics with her passion for travel, poetry, and thoughtful conversation. Friends described her as thoughtful, independent, and quietly radiant, the kind of presence that drew people in without effort. That afternoon, she planned only to consult a few volumes in the library. A simple, ordinary task, nothing remarkable in a day otherwise filled with the routines of campus life. The Petit Library was familiar to students and faculty alike. Shelves towered, corridors twisted between quiet study areas, and the air smelled faintly of books and dust. Betsy moved among the stacks with her usual grace, carrying a notebook, a pen, and a sense of purpose. No one could have predicted the violence that was about to unfold. Witnesses would later recall seeing Betsy briefly in the stacks, alone, focused on her work. Then, without warning, a man appeared and struck her. She fell, struck down in a moment of sudden brutality. By the time she was found, the life had been drained from her body. Panic rippled quietly through the library. Students and faculty who came upon the scene were shocked, their ordinary routines violently interrupted by an event so senseless that it left no clear explanation in its wake. Investigators combed the library and the surrounding campus for any trace of the perpetrator. Evidence was sparse. A single entry wound suggested a small caliber firearm had been used, but there were no clear witnesses to the attack, no clear motive, and no immediate suspects. The case was puzzling. Betsy had been careful, conscientious, and cautious. She had no known enemies, no connections to violent conflicts. The violence seemed to emerge from nowhere, targeting a young woman in a place presumed safe and familiar. The campus reacted with quiet horror. Students whispered in hallways, families and friends mourned, and the university community struggled to reconcile the ordinary environment with the extraordinary act that had occurred. Betsy's death was not just a crime. It was an intrusion into a world that had seemed secure, a reminder that danger can exist in the most familiar places. As time passed, the case lingered, unresolved. Investigators re-examined evidence with every advancement in forensic technology. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, old tips revisited, and the small, stubborn details of that November day scrutinized. The image of Betsy, young, vibrant, focused on her studies, remained frozen in the minds of those who had known her, a ghostly presence in the corridors where she had last walked. Betsy's family endured quietly. They carried the weight of grief into every day, her absence a constant presence, haunting and unresolved. Friends remembered the subtle details of her life, the way she laughed softly, the care with which she approached her work, the way she brought thoughtfulness and light to every conversation. The campus, too, retained a collective unease, a quiet vigilance born from the memory of that sudden violence. Even decades later, Betsy Ardsma's story endures in the quiet corners of a library, the spaces between shelves where students move, absorbed in their own studies. It exists in the flicker of fluorescent lights, the rustle of pages, the whispers of those who remember. It is a story that is felt more than understood, lingering in the shadow of an ordinary afternoon interrupted by tragedy. As night falls over State College, the library empties. Desks and chairs sit in silent rows. Books lie open and untouched. Somewhere in the quiet, the memory of Betsy lingers, a young woman with her whole life ahead, stolen in a moment that remains unexplained. And in that lingering presence, the story holds its quiet, persistent power, haunting not with spectacle, but with the sobering weight of absence. Next story, The Murder of Susan Powell, Utah, USA, 2009. The winter nights in West Valley City, Utah, have a stillness that feels almost unnatural. The snow blankets streets and lawns in a quiet hush, muffling distant traffic and the occasional dog barking. On December 6, 2009, in this suburban calm, the Powell family home became the center of a mystery that would grip a nation. Susan Powell, a 28-year-old mother, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind 2 young sons and a home filled with the ordinary signs of domestic life. Susan was known as meticulous, energetic, and devoted to her children. She had married Josh Powell, a man friends described as charismatic but sometimes unpredictable. Their life together seemed typical on the surface, a quiet house in a tidy neighborhood, routines revolving around school, work, and family activities. Neighbors recall seeing Susan smiling as she walked her children to school, arranging the home with care, and maintaining the appearance of a happy family. The night Susan vanished began like any other. She was last seen at home, asleep in the early hours while Josh prepared for work. The following morning, he called friends and relatives with a story. Susan was missing. She hadn't returned from a late-night outing, he said, though the details were inconsistent. Her car remained parked in the driveway, her personal items untouched. Inside the home, nothing indicated a struggle, yet the sense of unease grew rapidly. Authorities were called, and a search began immediately. Police interviewed neighbors, friends, and family. Josh Powell became the focus of scrutiny as inconsistencies in his statements emerged. He described arguments and tensions in the marriage, citing marital strain and Susan's dissatisfaction. Investigators noted the unusual behavior of the family dog, the signs of domestic tension, and the absence of any clear explanation for Susan's disappearance. The search for Susan spanned weeks, involving volunteers, law enforcement, and media coverage. Helicopters scanned surrounding areas, search dogs combed through parks and rivers, and tips flooded in from the public. The case took on a sense of urgency amplified by her 2 young sons, who remained in the care of their father while the investigation unfolded. The tension in the Powell household became apparent to authorities and neighbors alike, with glimpses of arguments, unusual behavior, and an atmosphere that seemed increasingly tense and controlled. Months passed, and the investigation revealed disturbing details. Josh Powell displayed controlling tendencies and had a history that drew attention from law enforcement. Inside the home, investigators noted evidence of preoccupation with firearms, secrecy, and efforts to shape the narrative of Susan's disappearance. The case became entwined with domestic patterns, subtle manipulation, and the ongoing challenge of discerning fact from fabrication. In the years that followed, the investigation continued in fits and starts. Josh Powell remained a central figure, his behavior under close scrutiny. The family's life outside the public eye was increasingly affected by legal proceedings, custody arrangements, and the relentless attention of investigators seeking to uncover what had happened. Susan's disappearance was a puzzle of timelines, digital evidence, and human behavior, with fragments of information revealing both mundane and disturbing details of her final days. The story of Susan Powell extended beyond the immediate search. Court filings, custody hearings, and eventual criminal proceedings brought her case into focus repeatedly. Investigators and prosecutors reconstructed events using forensic analysis, witness statements, and behavioral patterns. Each piece of evidence painted a partial picture: family dynamics, marital conflict, and a meticulous attention to the environment in which Susan lived and vanished. West Valley City itself, calm on the surface, retained traces of that winter night. Neighbors who had glimpsed the family now recalled the quiet tensions, the occasional heated exchanges, and the sense that something was off long before the disappearance. Susan's sons grew up under the weight of uncertainty, their lives shaped by absence, legal proceedings, and public scrutiny. The search for Susan Powell, her life, and her final moments became a complex interplay of human behavior, investigation, and the hidden patterns of domestic life. Each new lead, each re-examination of evidence, drew investigators deeper into the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. The case spanned years, connecting law enforcement, media, and community, all seeking the truth behind the quiet facade of a suburban home. Even as winter returned each year, and the snow fell quietly over West Valley City streets, the memory of Susan Powell lingered. Her life, the routines of family and home, and the abrupt absence that followed remained central to the ongoing investigation. The story unfolded across time, a careful layering of events, statements, and evidence, revealing the complex threads that bound domestic life to tragedy. Next story: the murder of Casey Anthony's daughter, Florida, USA, 2008. The sweltering summer air of Orlando, Florida, pressed heavily over quiet suburban streets, mingling with the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze. It was in this unassuming neighborhood that a small, tragic story began to unfold, one that would grip the nation and dominate headlines for months. On June 16, 2008, 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony disappeared from her family home, leaving behind confusion, fear, and a trail of questions that no one could easily answer. Kaylee was bright and curious, a toddler whose energy and laughter filled the house. Her mother, Casey Anthony, was a young woman whose life had often been described as chaotic, struggling to balance freedom, work, and responsibility. The household had seen tension, shifting routines, and moments of neglect. Yet Kaylee remained the center of small routines and fleeting joys, story time, play, and the simple milestones of early childhood. The alarm was raised weeks after Kaylee was last seen. Casey Anthony claimed that she had left her daughter with a nanny who had disappeared, though investigators soon determined there was no such caregiver. The story became increasingly contradictory. Casey's behavior, the inconsistencies in her accounts, and the absence of the child painted a picture of alarm and suspicion that prompted the Orlando Police Department to launch a full-scale investigation. Neighbors and friends provided fragments of information. Some remembered seeing Kaylee in the days before her disappearance, while others noticed the growing distance between her and her mother. The family home was searched extensively, tips poured in from the public, and the media attention intensified. Every detail was dissected: phone records, receipts, and Casey Anthony's social interactions. The city watched, rapt, as a mystery unfolded that seemed to grow stranger with each passing day. Days later, evidence began to mount. Kaylee's remains were discovered months later in a wooded area near the Anthony home. Forensic investigators reconstructed timelines, examined decomposition patterns, and analyzed the small, grim details that the Florida heat had imposed on the remains. The child's disappearance had become a homicide investigation, and the case now centered on the actions or inactions of her mother. Court proceedings stretched over weeks, months, and years. Prosecutors presented a complex narrative of neglect, opportunity, and the actions Casey may have taken in the days leading to her daughter's death. Defense attorneys countered with claims of misunderstanding, inconsistent witness testimony, and the difficulties of proving intention in such a case. Each day in court revealed new facets of the story. Evidence from Casey's digital footprint, interviews with friends and relatives, and the quiet, meticulous reconstruction of a tragic timeline. The trial became a national spectacle. News networks broadcast court sessions, experts debated forensic evidence, and the public followed the case with relentless scrutiny. Every small contradiction, every forensic detail, every witness statement was magnified. It was a case of both life and narrative, where the story of a missing child became entwined with media interpretation and legal strategy. Ultimately, the jury delivered a verdict that shocked many. Casey Anthony was acquitted of first-degree murder, a decision that split public opinion and left lingering questions about what truly happened in the days leading to Kaylee's death. Other charges, including providing false information to law enforcement, were upheld, but the case remained emotionally charged, leaving a haunting impression on the community and the nation. Orlando, in the years since, carries the memory of that summer. The neighborhood, once quiet and ordinary, remains marked by the events that unfolded there, the disappearance, and the complex legal proceedings that followed. For those who followed the story closely, the case is a reminder of how ordinary suburban life can intersect with tragedy, how small actions and decisions can ripple into devastating consequences, and how questions sometimes outlast answers. Even today, Kaylee Anthony is remembered not for the trial alone, but for the brief life she lived, her presence in a home filled with routine and play, and the tragic mystery that surrounded her final days. The story is layered with the ordinary and the extraordinary, with the daily rhythms of life interrupted by disappearance, investigation, and the relentless search for understanding. As the Florida heat softens into night, the streets fall silent. The quiet hum of air conditioners, distant traffic, and night creatures fills the air. And somewhere in the collective memory of those who followed her story, the echo of Kaylee Anthony lingers, a small presence, abruptly gone, leaving questions and shadows in its wake. Next story. The death of Anna Swiderski, California, USA, 2006. The early morning in Northridge, California, carried a sharpness that hinted at winter, though the sun had already begun to warm the quiet streets. On January 15, 2006, the neighborhood seemed ordinary, calm in the way suburban communities often appear in the hours before daily routines fully awaken. Yet, within this seeming normalcy, tragedy had quietly taken shape. Anna Swiderski, a 17-year-old high school student, was found dead. Her life ended far too soon, leaving a community stunned and searching for answers. Anna was a student at Northridge Academy High School, known for her bright smile and outgoing personality. She had dreams and routines familiar to any teenager: schoolwork, friends, social outings, and the quiet hope of a future beyond the familiar streets of her neighborhood. Her family remembered her as kind, energetic, and full of life, qualities that made the discovery of her death all the more devastating. The morning of her disappearance began like any other. Anna had attended school, interacted with classmates, and gone about her daily activities. Later that evening, she did not return home. Friends and family noticed her absence, initially hoping she had stayed late with friends or errands. But as hours passed and calls went unanswered, concern deepened. The ordinary rhythms of daily life had been disrupted, and the first signs of alarm appeared. Police were contacted, and a search began immediately. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, spoke with friends and classmates, and sought any clue to her whereabouts. Surveillance footage, digital records, and witness statements were collected, revealing only partial fragments of her movements. Each lead seemed to narrow possibilities while expanding the sense of uncertainty. The patterns of her life, once predictable, now carried a haunting ambiguity. The investigation revealed that Anna had met someone through social connections, someone who had become central to the mystery surrounding her death. Details emerged about interactions, messages, and meetings, illustrating the complexity of relationships in the digital age. Investigators reconstructed timelines carefully, seeking to understand the moments leading up to her disappearance and the circumstances that allowed tragedy to unfold unnoticed. Community members followed the case closely, offering tips and information. Volunteers joined searches, canvassing parks, streets, and surrounding areas. The story captured attention far beyond the immediate neighborhood, drawing concern from the broader public. Media outlets reported on her disappearance and death, documenting the search, the investigation, and the growing tension surrounding the case. For Anna's family, the experience was a quiet nightmare. Days stretched into weeks, filled with uncertainty, grief, and the unrelenting demand for answers. Friends recalled her warmth and energy, trying to reconcile their memories with the tragic reality that she was gone. Each day of investigation brought both hope and despair, as small leads either dissipated or opened new questions about the circumstances of her death. Even now, the memory of Anna Swiderski lingers in Northridge. The streets, the parks, the school hallways carry the echo of her presence. A teenager navigating life with friends and family, unaware of the danger that awaited. Her story remains a focal point for those who seek to understand how a life so ordinary could be interrupted so abruptly, and how a community copes when tragedy strikes so close to home. Night falls over the neighborhood, and the quiet hum of suburban life returns. Street lights glow over empty sidewalks. The rustle of leaves in the evening wind fills the spaces between houses, and the memory of Anna persists quietly, a reminder of absence and the lingering questions that accompany a life cut short. In that stillness, her story continues to unfold in the minds of those who remember her, a presence both tangible and haunting in the everyday fabric of the community. Next story, the murder of Sophie Lancaster, UK, 2007. The town of Bacup in Lancashire, England, had the quiet familiarity of a small English community in the early hours of August 11, 2007. Streetlights cast long shadows along the narrow lanes, and the late summer air carried a chill, unusual for that time of year. Sophie Lancaster, a young woman known for her distinct alternative appearance, had spent the evening with her boyfriend, Robin Hunt. They were part of a subculture often misunderstood, their clothes, hairstyles, and demeanor drawing attention wherever they went. But in that night, it wasn't admiration or curiosity that awaited them. It was violence, sudden and incomprehensible. Sophie, 20 years old, and Robin, 19, walked through the quiet streets after attending a local music event. Their lives were ordinary in every sense beyond their style. Students, friends, and young adults exploring their passions and identities. Sophie's vibrant personality and creativity shone through her distinctive Gothic fashion, a reflection of her individuality and her refusal to conform to societal norms. Those who knew her described a warm, intelligent, and artistic young woman, full of life and unafraid to express herself authentically. As they walked together that night, a group of young men noticed them. What began as a chance encounter quickly escalated into aggression. Words were exchanged, tension rose, and suddenly, Sophie and Robin were attacked. The assailants, driven by prejudice and intolerance, inflicted a ferocious assault. Sophie was struck repeatedly, kicked, and beaten with brutality that showed no mercy. Robin fought to protect her, but he was overpowered, unable to stop the violence that unfolded in the dimly lit streets. The attack lasted several minutes, each moment marked by confusion, fear, and desperation. Neighbors later recounted hearing shouts and commotion, but by the time anyone could intervene, the assailants had fled, leaving Sophie gravely injured. She was rushed to Royal Blackburn Hospital, unconscious, with multiple injuries that would prove life-threatening. Medical staff worked urgently to stabilize her, but the trauma was severe, and despite their efforts, Sophie's condition deteriorated rapidly. Sophie succumbed to her injuries on August 24th, 13 days after the attack. The news reverberated through the community, bringing shock, anger, and grief. A vigil was held in her honor, attended by hundreds who wanted to remember her life, her individuality, and the senselessness of her death. Friends and family spoke of her creativity, her courage, and the way she embraced life unapologetically, traits that had drawn admiration long before that night of violence. The investigation that followed quickly identified the perpetrators. Michael Hulin and Brian Hunt, two young men with histories of aggression and criminal activity, were arrested and charged with murder. Court proceedings revealed the details of the attack, the unprovoked nature, the cruelty inflicted, and the deliberate targeting of Sophie and Robin because of their appearance and lifestyle. Testimonies from Robin, witnesses, and forensic evidence painted a stark picture of the brutality that had occurred, leaving little room for doubt about the severity and intent behind the crime. The trial drew national attention, highlighting not only the specifics of the murder, but also the broader issues it raised. Discussions emerged about intolerance, prejudice, and the dangers faced by those who live outside conventional norms. Media coverage explored Sophie's life, her personality, her creative endeavors, and the shock of a death so rooted in hatred and misunderstanding. As the trial unfolded, the community grappled with the reality that such extreme violence could erupt from seemingly trivial differences in appearance or lifestyle. Hulin and Hunt were ultimately convicted, receiving life sentences for the murder of Sophie Lancaster. The legal process meticulously documented the timeline of the attack, the injuries sustained, and the motivations behind the crime. Forensic details, witness statements, and expert analysis provided a full account of what had transpired that night, ensuring that the events would be preserved in public record. In the aftermath, Sophie's family and supporters focused on remembrance and advocacy. The Sophie Lancaster Foundation was established to raise awareness about hate crimes, bullying, and discrimination, aiming to prevent similar tragedies. Her story became emblematic of the consequences of prejudice and the importance of tolerance, inspiring conversations in schools, communities, and policy discussions across the UK. The streets of Bacup, where the attack took place, carry the memory of that night. The quiet residential roads, once ordinary and familiar, now mark the site of a tragedy that resonated far beyond the town. Neighbors recall the somber response, the vigils, and the ways the community came together in the wake of violence. Sophie's life, short but vibrant, is remembered through art, music, and initiatives that honor her individuality and promote understanding. Sophie's friends describe her as fiercely loyal, imaginative, and empathetic. She had dreams of creating a life that was fully her own, guided by creativity and self-expression. Her death, sudden and violent, cut short those plans, leaving a gap felt by everyone who knew her. The people who loved her focused on keeping her memory alive, telling her story, and ensuring that her experience would not be forgotten. The legal and social response to her death created a framework for confronting similar crimes in the future. Hate crimes legislation, public awareness campaigns, and advocacy groups drew attention to the vulnerabilities faced by young people who, like Sophie, lived authentically but were targeted for their differences. The case became a reference point in education and community outreach, emphasizing prevention, empathy, and vigilance. Sophie Lancaster's story is remembered not just in headlines, but in the lives she touched and the changes inspired by her death. Her individuality, her courage, and the tragedy of that August night remain central to how she is honored. Art, writings, and memorials serve as reminders of both the loss and the enduring impact of a young woman whose life, though cut short, sparked awareness and action. The night of August 11th, 2007, is etched in the consciousness of Bacup and beyond, marking the violent end of a young life full of promise and expression. The streets where Sophie walked, the home she passed, and the community she inhabited carry traces of the events, a record of both human cruelty and resilience. Her story continues to be told in classrooms, communities, and initiatives, a testament to her presence and the effort to prevent such senseless violence in the future. Next story, the murder of Jill Maher, Australia, 2012. The streets of Melbourne were quiet on the night of September 21st, 2012, The city's nightlife had begun to wind down, leaving only the occasional pedestrian and the distant hum of traffic. Jill Maurer, a young woman of 29, had just finished a night out with friends, sharing laughs, stories, and the kind of camaraderie that feels endless in the moment. She walked home alone, navigating the familiar streets that had seemed safe countless times before. Jill was known for her warmth, intelligence, and dedication to her work in public relations. Friends described her as vibrant, compassionate, and full of energy, someone whose presence could lift a room. That night, she moved with the ordinary confidence of someone accustomed to city life, unaware that danger awaited along the path she had taken so many times before. Shortly after leaving the bar, Jill was approached by Adrian Bailey, a man with a history of violent crimes. What followed was a brutal and sudden attack. She was abducted in the quiet streets, taken to a different location, and held against her will. Over the following hours, she endured horrific violence at the hands of her captor, whose actions would ultimately end her life. Authorities were alerted quickly after Jill failed to return home. Police conducted searches across the city, interviewing witnesses, reviewing surveillance footage, and following leads that slowly began to form a picture of what had occurred. The timeline revealed the terrifying sequence: Jill's last movements, the abduction, and the subsequent acts that led to her death. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through Melbourne. Friends, family, and colleagues mobilized, distributing flyers, contacting authorities, and offering support to each other in the growing fear and uncertainty. The city watched closely as the investigation unfolded, every detail scrutinized in the media, and public concern mounting with each passing day. Jill's body was discovered 10 days later in a shallow grave in a rural area outside the city. The scene revealed the extent of the violence she had endured. Forensic analysis confirmed the brutality of the attack, documenting injuries that painted a grim picture of the final hours of her life. The discovery galvanized the police investigation, narrowing their search for the perpetrator. Adrian Bailey was soon apprehended and charged. Evidence, including DNA and witness testimony, connected him to Jill's murder and other previous crimes. Court proceedings detailed the sequence of events, the victim's movements, and the calculated nature of the attack. The trial revealed the chilling contrast between Jill's ordinary night out and the violence she encountered, illustrating the sudden and devastating intrusion of danger into everyday life. The public response was immediate and intense. Vigils were held across the city, gatherings in honor of Jill and to demand justice. Social media campaigns amplified awareness, and discussions about safety, urban risks, and the criminal justice system dominated headlines. Friends and family spoke openly about Jill's character, her kindness, creativity, and the life she led before that September night. Bailey was eventually convicted of Jill Maurer's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The trial documented the violence and premeditation, leaving no doubt about the events that had transpired. For the community, the conviction brought a sense of closure, but it could not erase the impact of Jill's loss or the fear and grief that had gripped Melbourne during her disappearance. The streets where Jill had walked became silent reminders of the fragility of safety, the unpredictability of danger, and the sudden intrusion of violence into ordinary routines. Her story resonated nationally, prompting changes in policing, public awareness campaigns, and conversations about personal safety in urban environments. Friends and family continued to honor her memory through advocacy, education, and remembrance events. Jill Maurer's life, vibrant and full of potential, was cut tragically short. The city streets, the bars she frequented, and the neighborhoods she called home carry the shadow of that night, a stark reminder of vulnerability and the devastating consequences of a violent encounter. Her memory is preserved through the ongoing efforts of loved ones, the legal record of her case, and the community's response to an event that left an indelible mark on Melbourne. Next story: the murder of Vanessa Guillen, Texas, USA, 2020. Fort Hood, Texas, a sprawling military installation, carried the usual hum of activity in the spring of 2020. Soldiers moved through barracks and training grounds, the sound of boots striking pavement mixing with distant vehicle engines. Vanessa Guillen, a 20-year-old Army specialist, navigated this environment daily, balancing the strict routines of military life with her personal aspirations and dreams. She was known for her diligence, her warm personality, and the quiet determination she brought to both training and her interactions with colleagues. Vanessa's days were regimented, yet full of ambition. She trained rigorously, followed orders meticulously, and maintained close relationships with friends within the military. Outside work, she enjoyed hobbies, stayed connected with family, and planned for a future beyond Fort Hood. Her family and friends described her as disciplined, bright, and full of life. A young woman who balanced responsibility with a spirited approach to life. In April 2020, Vanessa's life took a sudden and tragic turn. She was reported missing after failing to return from her work duties. Initial searches on the base revealed no trace of her, and the absence of clear evidence immediately concerned her colleagues and family. The investigation began quietly, complicated by the structure and scale of the military environment, as officers and investigators sought to piece together the movements leading to her disappearance. It soon emerged that Vanessa had been targeted by a fellow soldier, someone who exploited trust and proximity within the military setting. The perpetrator lured her to a remote location on the base, where she was confronted and attacked. Over the following hours, she endured violence that ended her life, her body concealed on the property in a manner meant to obscure discovery. The disappearance quickly drew attention beyond the base. Family members campaigned publicly, contacting media outlets and law enforcement, urging immediate action to find Vanessa. Social media amplified their efforts, spreading awareness across Texas and the United States. The public response was swift and intense, reflecting both concern for her safety and outrage over the circumstances surrounding her absence. Authorities intensified their search, reviewing security footage, conducting interviews, and coordinating with military and civilian law enforcement. The evidence gathered revealed the crime, its location, and the involvement of the perpetrator, a soldier whose actions violated both the law and the trust of his fellow service members. The details of Vanessa's final hours, when disclosed, shocked the nation. Her body was eventually recovered near the base, confirming the tragic outcome of the disappearance. The manner of the murder and the attempts to conceal it highlighted the calculated nature of the crime, leaving investigators, family, and the public grappling with the depth of the betrayal within a trusted environment. Legal proceedings followed, documenting the sequence of events and ensuring accountability. The perpetrator was arrested and charged, with court documents detailing the abduction, assault, and murder. Testimony, evidence, and forensic analysis created a timeline of the crime, exposing both the proximity of danger within the military context and the vulnerability of those targeted. Vanessa's family, friends, and the wider community responded with grief, memorials, and advocacy. The tragedy sparked national conversations about safety on military bases, harassment, and the responsibilities of commanding officers. Her story became a catalyst for change, prompting reforms in reporting mechanisms, base security protocols, and awareness campaigns to prevent similar incidents. The barracks, training grounds, and quiet paths of Fort Hood, once ordinary backdrops to daily military life, now bear the weight of Vanessa Guillen's story. Soldiers, family members, and the public remember her for her dedication, her character, and the life tragically cut short. Her legacy continues through advocacy, remembrance events, and ongoing efforts to ensure that no service member faces the dangers she endured alone. Vanessa's life, disciplined and full of promise, ended in a moment that reverberated far beyond the base. Her name, her story, and the circumstances of her death remain embedded in public consciousness, a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence within an environment built on trust and structure. The city of Killeen, the military installation, and the broader United States hold her memory as a call to action, a record of loss, and a testament to resilience in the pursuit of justice. Next story. The Murder of Rebecca Zahau, California, USA, 2011. Laguna Beach, California, is known for its dramatic coastline, cliffs that drop sharply into the Pacific, and a soft roar of waves breaking against jagged rocks. In the early morning of July 13, 2011, the cliffs and homes along Coast Highway seemed quiet, bathed in the faint golden light of sunrise. At one of the sprawling mansions perched above the ocean, Rebecca Zahau, a 32-year-old woman, lived with her fiancé's family, maintaining a life that combined luxury with ordinary routines. Rebecca was described by friends and acquaintances as intelligent, spirited, and devoted to her family and loved ones. She balanced social engagements, work, and relationships with an easy confidence, often navigating the complexities of life in a high-profile household. That morning, her presence in the mansion would be her last. Rebecca's body was discovered on the side of the house, hanging from the balcony. The scene was both shocking and mysterious, the circumstances immediately raising questions for law enforcement, neighbors, and the local community. The mansion, quiet and orderly moments before, now became the center of intense scrutiny and speculation. Neighbors and passers-by recalled the stillness that morning, the sound of emergency vehicles, and the presence of authorities moving cautiously around the property. The first responders arrived to find Rebecca's body suspended, and the area was quickly secured. Initial observations suggested an act of violence, but the unusual nature of the scene complicated the narrative of what had occurred. Friends and family struggled to understand the events that led to her death. Rebecca's life had been full of ordinary routines, mornings spent preparing for the day, interactions with family, and engagements with her social circle. None of these activities had hinted at danger or imminent tragedy. The contrast between her everyday life and the scene of her death intensified the sense of shock. Investigators examined the property, collecting evidence, documenting the scene, and attempting to reconstruct the events of the early morning hours. The architecture of the mansion, the layout of balconies, stairways, and rooms became critical in understanding how the incident had unfolded. Each detail, from the position of furniture to the angles of the balcony railing, was analyzed to establish the sequence of events. Rebecca's family faced a profound sense of loss and confusion. The circumstances surrounding her death, unusual and unsettling, left them grappling with unanswered questions. Friends described her energy, her humor, and her dedication to loved ones, highlighting the stark contrast between the life she led and the moment she died. The local community responded with both mourning and curiosity. Laguna Beach, a town accustomed to natural beauty and tourist activity, was suddenly linked to a case that dominated headlines. Media coverage focused on the circumstances of Rebecca's death, her background, and the physical scene, fueling speculation and debate across the region. The investigation and subsequent legal proceedings examined the events in meticulous detail. Law enforcement documented every aspect of the property and the surrounding area, using forensic evidence, witness statements, and expert testimony to reconstruct the incident. Public interest remained high, with debates over the unusual and tragic circumstances of her passing dominating news cycles for weeks. Rebecca Zahau's life, filled with personal connections, plans, and ordinary routines, ended in a moment that seemed disconnected from her daily existence. The mansion, its balconies, and the cliffs that framed it became forever associated with her death. Friends and family preserved her memory through personal accounts, photographs, and remembrances, highlighting the qualities that had defined her life before tragedy struck. The story of Rebecca's final hours, her presence in the house, and the events that led to her death remain etched in public record. Laguna Beach itself, serene and scenic, bears the imprint of a life interrupted. The mansion standing as a silent witness to a moment that changed everything for those who knew her. The ordinary beauty of the surroundings contrasts sharply with the violence of the event, leaving a lingering impression of how unpredictably life can shift from routine to tragedy. Next story, the disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley, Caribbean/USA, 1998. The Caribbean in March of 1998 was alive with the usual warmth of sun and sea. Cruise ships glided through turquoise waters, their decks crowded with passengers enjoying the clear skies and tropical breeze. Amy Lynn Bradley, a 23-year-old from New Jersey, was aboard one such ship, navigating the excitement and freedom of a Caribbean vacation with her family. Her life, until that point, had been filled with ambition, travel, and ordinary pursuits. She had recently graduated from college, explored new opportunities, and sought the experiences that defined youth. Amy was known for her vivacious personality, charm, and independence. Friends and family described her as adventurous and outgoing, with a readiness to engage fully in life's experiences. That evening, she spent time socializing, enjoying the onboard activities, and connecting with fellow passengers. The cruise deck was bustling, filled with laughter, music, and a gentle slap of waves against the hull. When Amy failed to return to her cabin that night, concern quickly escalated. Initial searches aboard the ship revealed no trace of her. Crew members, security personnel, and family combed the vessel, retracing her steps through restaurants, lounges, and promenades, but she was nowhere to be found. The impossibility of the situation, the controlled environment of a ship, the small area to search, made the disappearance even more alarming. Authorities were contacted, and reports were filed with both U.S. and international law enforcement. Investigators examined surveillance footage, spoke with passengers and crew, and reconstructed timelines of Amy's last known movements. Every detail, from conversations she had to locations she visited, was scrutinized for clues that might explain her disappearance. Family members were thrust into a frantic search, coordinating with authorities and publicizing Amy's story through media outlets. Her parents traveled to the Caribbean, speaking with officials and gathering information in hopes of finding their daughter. The cruise line cooperated but could provide only limited insight into what might have happened on a vessel carrying hundreds of people. Days passed, and the uncertainty intensified. Rumors circulated, from sightings to unconfirmed reports, but no definitive evidence emerged. Investigators considered the possibilities: accidental fall, foul play, or abduction. Each scenario weighed against the controlled environment of the ship and the behavior of those on board. Yet no conclusion could be drawn, leaving the narrative fragmented and the family desperate for answers. The story of Amy Lynn Bradley drew national attention. Media coverage chronicled her disappearance, the searches undertaken, and the growing mystery surrounding the case. Public fascination combined with genuine concern as communities followed updates and mourned the absence of resolution. Advocates highlighted the risks associated with travel and the challenges of investigating incidents in international waters, emphasizing both procedural and jurisdictional difficulties. Years later, Amy's case remained unresolved, a chilling reminder of the vulnerability that can exist even in seemingly safe and controlled environments. Her family continued to campaign for information, offering rewards, engaging private investigators, and keeping the story alive through media interviews and public appeals. Her disappearance became a reference point for discussions about missing persons, maritime security, and the complexities of cases that cross national boundaries. Amy's life, full of promise, adventure, and personal ambition, was frozen at the moment of her vanishing. The Caribbean waters, the cruise ship, and the paths she walked aboard the vessel became symbols of both freedom and fragility. Friends and family remembered her energy, her charm, and the life she lived before that night, keeping her memory alive even as the circumstances of her disappearance remained elusive. The mystery of Amy Lynn Bradley continues to linger in public consciousness. Cruise routes, the Caribbean islands, and the stories told by passengers who were present that night serve as fragments of a narrative that remains incomplete. Her story highlights the thin line between ordinary experiences and sudden tragedy, leaving a lasting impression on all who follow the case and the efforts to uncover what truly happened. Next story: the murder of Allison Parker, Virginia, USA, 2015. Monetta, Virginia, is a town framed by the Blue Ridge Mountains and the calm waters of Smith Mountain Lake. On the morning of August 26, 2015, Allison Parker, a 24-year-old reporter for WDBJ7, prepared for a routine live broadcast. She had built her career on curiosity, professionalism, and a dedication to storytelling, qualities that made her a rising star in local journalism. That morning, Allison and her colleague, cameraman Adam Ward, were on location at Bridgewater Plaza for a feature segment on a small business, unaware that the ordinary assignment would end in tragedy. Allison's presence on screen had always been marked by warmth, clarity, and confidence. Her colleagues described her as dedicated, precise, and charismatic, someone who combined the rigors of reporting with a genuine connection to the community. Adam Ward, equally committed to his craft, worked seamlessly with Allison, capturing visuals that enhanced the stories they presented. Together, they represented the familiar professionalism of local news, delivering stories with both clarity and humanity. During the live broadcast, an individual approached the pair with a firearm. In a moment that stunned viewers and bystanders, the shooting unfolded in real time, captured on camera and witnessed by many both in person and via the live feed. The abrupt violence transformed a routine reporting assignment into an event of national attention, drawing immediate law enforcement response and media coverage. Emergency responders arrived quickly, attempting to provide aid and secure the scene. Despite their efforts, Allison and Adam were killed, and the suspect fled in a vehicle before being pursued by authorities. The magnitude of the event, its visibility on live television, and the suddenness of the act created a shockwave through the community and across the nation. Investigators worked to piece together the motive, background, and circumstances surrounding the shooting. The suspect, a former colleague of the station, was identified, and law enforcement reviewed past interactions, complaints, and incidents that might explain the escalation to lethal violence. The case highlighted both personal grievances and the risks that can emerge from professional conflicts, culminating in a devastating act of public violence. The trial that followed examined every aspect of the shooting: the suspect's preparation, the dynamics with the victims, and the sequence of events captured in footage and witness accounts. Legal proceedings detailed the events meticulously, from the moments leading up to the shooting to the eventual apprehension and prosecution of the perpetrator. Allison Parker's family and friends navigated grief, public attention, and the aftermath of a tragedy that was witnessed by thousands. Tributes poured in from colleagues, viewers, and community members who remembered her professionalism, dedication, and warmth. Memorials were organized, honoring both Allison and Adam, ensuring their lives and work were recognized beyond the tragedy of their deaths. The community of Moneta and the staff of WDBJ7 faced the reality of violence in a public, visible space. The event prompted discussions about workplace safety, mental health, and security protocols for journalists in the field. The footage, though widely disseminated, was treated with sensitivity by some outlets, acknowledging the gravity of the moment while focusing on remembrance rather than sensationalism. Allison's life, defined by curiosity, ambition, and commitment to storytelling, ended suddenly in a place she occupied daily for work and professional growth. Her legacy remains tied to her contributions to journalism, the connection she fostered with her audience, and the memory of her presence in the community. Friends and family preserve her memory through stories, scholarship funds, and community initiatives that honor her character and professional impact. Next story: the murder of Sherry Rasmussen, California, USA, 1986. Night settles over Los Angeles in a way that masks both beauty and danger. Streetlights flicker along quiet residential avenues, and the distant hum of the city creates a low, continuous murmur that seems to stretch for miles. On February 24th, 1986, in the San Fernando Valley, this calm would be broken in a way that remained unsolved for more than 2 decades. The life of Sherry Rasmussen, a 34-year-old nurse, would come to a violent, tragic end, hidden beneath the ordinary routines of suburban life. Sherry was known for her warmth and dedication. a registered nurse at Valley Presbyterian Hospital. She cared for her patients with quiet professionalism, and those who knew her remembered her as intelligent, friendly, and vibrant. She had recently ended a marriage, yet her friends described her as hopeful, looking forward to building a new life and striving to find stability amidst the unpredictability of personal relationships. The evening of February 23rd was ordinary. Sherry attended her regular routines, spent time at home, and prepared for the coming week. But by the following morning, she would not answer calls or appear at her job. When her roommate checked the apartment that morning, she discovered a scene that no one could have predicted. Sherry's body lay on the floor of her home, bludgeoned, her life violently taken in what appeared to be a sudden attack. There were signs of struggle, yet nothing was immediately taken from the apartment. The crime scene was quiet, contained, but the questions it raised were profound and unsettling. Los Angeles police launched an investigation, yet the trail was confusing and elusive. There were no eyewitnesses. No fingerprints immediately linked anyone to the crime. The initial investigation focused on Sherry's acquaintances, her personal life, and those who might have had motive to harm her. The first leads were tantalizing but frustratingly thin. For decades, the case remained a cold file, evidence locked away, answers just beyond reach. The breakthrough came unexpectedly in the 2000s, thanks to advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis. Investigators revisited the case, re-examining the crime scene evidence with methods unavailable at the time of the murder. The meticulous work paid off. In 2009, more than 23 years after Sherry Rasmussen was killed, police arrested Stephanie Lazarus, a former LAPD detective, in connection with the murder. The revelation shocked the community. A law enforcement officer, trained to protect, had allegedly committed this violent crime. The motive, investigators concluded, was rooted in jealousy and obsession. Lazarus had previously been romantically involved with Sherry's husband, and unresolved feelings, combined with opportunity and planning, led to a tragic confrontation. Sherry's murder, though long unresolved, had finally been traced to someone known, someone who understood the very systems designed to catch criminals, and who had initially hidden behind the guise of authority and order. The trial captivated the public, not only for the shocking revelation of a police officer as the perpetrator, but also for the way the story unfolded across decades. Evidence was presented with painstaking clarity. Forensic details, DNA matches, timelines reconstructed with precision, and testimony from those who knew both women and the husband involved. In 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life. Justice, delayed but determined, had been served. Yet, the story of Sherry Rasmussen endures beyond the verdict. It is not merely a tale of murder and resolution, but a reflection on the hidden undercurrents that can flow through everyday life. A quiet neighborhood, ordinary routines, and people who seem familiar can mask the deepest dangers. Sherry's life, vibrant and full, was extinguished in a moment of calculated violence, leaving behind a community shaken and a family forever changed. The quiet streets of the San Fernando Valley, which once carried the gentle rhythm of suburban life, now hold a memory that lingers. A nurse, a friend, a woman whose potential and warmth were stolen abruptly. Her story serves as a reminder that danger can exist in proximity, behind friendly faces, or even badges meant to protect. And in the hush of night, those who remember Sherry still feel the echo of her presence, interrupted too soon, and the weight of her absence, carried quietly through the years. As night returns to Los Angeles, the city hums on, indifferent yet subtly aware of the lives it has lost. The tale of Sherry Rasmussen is a quiet testament to resilience, to the perseverance of justice, and to the way memory preserves the essence of those taken too soon. Even in darkness, even after decades, her story speaks, softly but insistently, a reminder of life interrupted, yet never forgotten. Next story, Skylar Neese, 2012, West Virginia, USA. The small town of Fairmont, West Virginia, lies nestled among rolling hills and quiet neighborhoods where life moves at a measured pace. Streets wind through residential areas with the predictability of routine. Children ride bikes on sidewalks, and neighbors maintain a watchful yet casual eye over each other. For 16-year-old Skylar Neese, this was the landscape of adolescence, a space that, in theory, offered familiarity, freedom, and the comfort of community. Skylar was described by friends and family as lively, engaging, and intelligent. She had ambitions that stretched beyond her hometown, aspirations for college, and a social circle she navigated with care and attention. On the evening of July 6, 2012, she was at home with family, engaging in the typical rhythms of teenage life. Conversations with siblings, texting friends, and planning for the days ahead. The night held nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest that within hours, the ordinary would fracture irrevocably. The first signs of disruption were subtle. Skylar left the house briefly with friends, a walk that had been routine countless times before. But that evening, the familiar paths became the setting for an orchestrated plan. Two of her close acquaintances, Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, harbored intentions that would shatter the perception of trust that Skylar had placed in her peer group. Their familiarity with her routines, knowledge of her movements, and access to private moments allowed them to transform ordinary teenage interactions into a fatal encounter. The attack itself was swift, violent, and executed with a calculated coldness that belied the apparent normalcy of the participants. Skylar was abducted, taken to a remote location, and killed. A stark contrast to the suburban streets she had walked freely. The act was deliberate, and its planning was embedded in the minutes, days, and weeks leading up to it. The intimacy of betrayal, being harmed by people considered friends, added a chilling dimension to the crime, making it resonate far beyond the immediate community. In the hours and days following her disappearance, Fairmont's residents mobilized in search and support. Friends and family-coordinated searches, checked every route she might have taken, and collaborated with law enforcement to trace her last known movements. Investigators relied on digital records, witness statements, and subtle behavioral patterns to reconstruct the sequence of events. The challenge was compounded by the fact that Skylar's perpetrators were peers, individuals who knew the community and how to exploit it while minimizing suspicion. Evidence gradually emerged, piecing together the horrifying reality. Investigators documented the moments leading to the abduction, the travel to remote locations, and the methods used to conceal the crime. Forensic and testimonial evidence illuminated the sequence, revealing both the planning and the relational dynamics that had facilitated such violence. The subsequent arrests of Eddy and Schoaf set in motion a legal process that would confront the unusual nature of adolescent-perpetrated homicide, the psychology of betrayal, and the implications for community safety. The trial exposed layers of complexity, the challenge of understanding juvenile offenders capable of premeditated murder, the intersections of coercion, loyalty, and moral reasoning among peers, and the emotional toll on a community grappling with a violent disruption of its assumed safety. Families, schools, and law enforcement were left to reconcile the ordinariness of the suburban environment with the extraordinary nature of the crime committed within it. Years later, Fairmont continues its routines. Streets are walked, parks are visited, and life progresses with the rhythms of small-town normalcy. Yet beneath that continuity, the absence of Skylar Neese is felt by those who knew her, and the story of her final hours endures in the careful recollections of investigators, family, and community members. The ordinary spaces she once navigated, sidewalks, intersections, local shops, are imbued with memory, the subtle reminder that trust and familiarity can be manipulated, and that ordinary life can, in an instant, become the setting for unspeakable loss. Next story, the case of Centoya Brown, 2004, Tennessee, USA. Nashville in the early 2000s was a city of contrasts. Glittering neon lights from honky-donks and country music stages blended with quieter residential streets. where families moved through daily routines largely unnoticed. Amidst this backdrop, the life of Cyntoia Brown unfolded, shaped by hardship, resilience, and a struggle for survival that would ultimately collide with the legal system in a way that shocked the nation. Cyntoia was 16 when the events that would define her life began. She had grown up navigating trauma that left her exposed to dangers most adults could scarcely imagine. From an early age, she was placed in unstable environments, moving between foster homes and temporary residences, each transition leaving her increasingly aware of the precariousness of her circumstances. Nashville streets became both a refuge and a threat. She knew them intimately, understanding how to navigate spaces while evading those who sought to exploit vulnerability. At the same time, Cyntoia was forced into circumstances that no child should endure. She became involved with older men through transactional relationships, seeking shelter, security, and a semblance of control in a world that had offered her little. These choices, though born of necessity, exposed her to extraordinary risk. Each night carried uncertainty, each encounter a delicate balance between survival and danger. Her movements through Nashville's neighborhoods were cautious, strategic, and informed by years of learning which paths were safe and which were not. On the night of August 6, 2004, Cyntoia encountered a man named Johnny Allen. He was 43, significantly older, and engaged in behaviors that marked him as predatory. When she entered his home, she found herself in a situation fraught with fear, uncertainty, and the immediacy of potential violence. What followed would forever alter the trajectory of her life. In a moment she described as self-defense, she shot and killed Allen. The aftermath of that single act transformed Nashville streets from familiar terrain into a legal battlefield. Police and investigators approached the case through the lens of homicide, while prosecutors framed it as premeditated murder. The courtroom became a stage where past trauma, survival instincts, and legal definitions collided. Details of her life, foster placements, exploitation, and exposure to violence were scrutinized alongside the immediate circumstances of the killing, forcing public attention to grapple with questions of age, culpability, and the intersections of victimhood and agency. For Cyntoia, each day in the justice system was a navigation of fear, regret, and survival in a different form. Detention facilities, courtrooms, and interviews became extensions of the streets she had known, spaces where power dynamics and vulnerability were starkly visible. She learned quickly how to move carefully within these spaces, understanding that her ability to articulate her story, comply with procedures, and present herself strategically could affect her fate. The media coverage amplified the tension, creating narratives that often ignored nuance. Some framed her as a cold-blooded killer, others as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Each article, television segment, and editorial contributed to a collective perception that alternated between condemnation and sympathy. Friends and advocates, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to provide context. That Cyntoia's actions could not be understood without acknowledging the persistent exposure to violence and exploitation that had defined her adolescence. Her eventual conviction brought long-term consequences, a life sentence that would hold her within the system for years. Yet even within confinement, Cyntoia's story evolved. Education, advocacy, and legal appeals became part of her daily rhythm, offering glimpses of agency within a structure designed to limit it. Her experiences highlighted the challenges of addressing juvenile crimes, the impact of trauma on decision-making, and the broader societal failures that place young people in situations of extreme vulnerability. Through it all, the streets of Nashville moved on. Neon signs flickered, traffic hummed, and the rhythms of daily life continued as if uninterrupted. But for those who knew her story, the city was a landscape marked by absence, tension, and the faint imprint of survival against overwhelming odds. Cyntoia Brown's experience was a reminder not in platitudes, but in the slow accumulation of detail. The places she walked, the people she encountered, the moments that demanded impossible choices, and the way ordinary spaces could become arenas of extraordinary consequence. Next story, Mark and Deborah Constantino, 2015, Sparks/Reno, Nevada. There's a particular stillness to certain suburban neighborhoods at night. Rows of dimly lit windows, cars cooling in driveways, a feeling that everything has folded into routine. But behind closed doors, lives can drift into currents no one on the outside notices. Mark and Deborah Constantino had lived much of their married life in the public eye, drawn into the small, intense world of paranormal television. Their presence on ghost hunting programs gave them a certain kind of visibility, a familiar face to viewers who followed late-night explorations of abandoned hospitals, prisons, and forgotten places. But fame, even niche fame, can cast shadows, and the story that unfolded between them was not one of hauntings in old buildings. It was something far more human and far more volatile. Their marriage had been troubled for years, marked by escalating conflict, separations, and repeated cycles of reconciliation and breakdown. Friends and colleagues saw flashes of tension, but often dismissed them as the fiery edges of a passionate, complicated relationship. Behind that, though, were police reports, restraining orders, and a pattern of violence that grew sharper as time went on. The paranormal shows that featured them often hinted at intensity, but the real intensity lived in the quiet periods between shoots, arguments that flared into something dangerous, accusations, and a type of pressure that builds slowly until suddenly it doesn't build anymore. It detonates. On September 22, 2015, Reno police responded to a scene that looked, at first glance, like a standoff out of a movie. A woman had been found dead, Susan, Mark and Deborah's adult daughter. Her death led officers to an apartment complex in Sparks, Nevada, where the situation escalated almost instantly. Inside, Mark had taken Deborah hostage, and this was not a spontaneous decision, not a moment of panic born within that day. It had the shape of something that had been brewing, of a long chain of unresolved violence that had reached its endpoint. Police negotiators tried to slow everything down, to pull the tension back from the brink. Outside, neighbors gathered behind caution tape, whispering, trying to understand the swirl of sirens and lights cutting through their quiet street. Inside the apartment, hours passed. Mark refused to surrender. The negotiation moved in circles, the way these things often do. Please, pauses, dead ends. The air inside would have been thick with desperation, fear, and a kind of emotional claustrophobia that leaves no room for rational thought. When the standoff ended, it did so abruptly. Officers breached the apartment. A gunshot cracked through the room. When they entered, they found both Mark and Deborah dead. The news spread quickly, ricocheting through social media, TV networks, and the paranormal community. People who had watched the Constantinos on television struggled to reconcile the couple they thought they knew with the reality that had quietly been unfolding behind the scenes. But the truth is that most of the story had been visible, just not fully believed. Court records, police reports, and restraining orders had already outlined the trajectory in stark detail, long before the final night. Violence rarely arrives without warning. It creeps, it repeats, it escalates. In the aftermath, the case became one of those stories that people whisper about in the same way they whisper in old hallways on ghost hunts, quietly, carefully, afraid to disturb something. Not because of supernatural fear, but because tragedies rooted in real lives have a way of unsettling people more deeply than any phantom ever could. It was not a mystery full of unanswered questions. It was a slow unraveling, a chain reaction set in motion years earlier, ending in the one place it always seemed to be heading. No abandoned prison, no haunted farmhouse, no decaying asylum ever held the kind of darkness that lived inside that apartment on that September morning. The constant tension, the emotional whiplash, the collapse of boundaries, the silence that followed. It all felt heavier than any ghost story. In the end, their final moments were not cinematic, not mysterious, not wrapped in paranormal intrigue. They were painfully human, shaped by violence that had become a pattern long before cameras ever pointed in their direction. Behind every dramatic flicker of a flashlight on TV, behind every EVP recording or creaking floorboard, lived two people whose real-life haunting was happening in private, unseen, unheard, and unresolved until the moment everything stopped. The neighborhood in Sparks eventually went quiet again. Cars returned to their parking spaces. Lights switched off, but that apartment and the story inside it left a mark that lingers far longer than any ghost hunt. It sits in the silence that follows, in the uncomfortable truth that the darkest stories rarely come from abandoned buildings. They come from the places where people live, argue, love, and break apart. Now, on to the next story. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, life in 2009 followed familiar rhythms. The city was a blend of residential neighborhoods, desert landscapes, and urban development, where communities moved through daily routines under the expectation of safety. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life, a chilling discovery would expose a hidden darkness and leave an indelible mark on the city's history. Over the course of several months, authorities uncovered a series of human remains buried on the city's West Mesa, revealing the horrifying work of what would come to be known as the West Mesa Bone Collector. The investigation began in February 2009, when a local resident reported discovering human bones in a remote desert area west of Albuquerque. Law enforcement officers arrived and confirmed the presence of multiple remains, prompting an extensive search and the establishment of a large-scale investigation. Over time, authorities recovered the remains of at least 11 women, all of whom had gone missing between 2003 and 2005. The discovery shocked the community and revealed the scope of a serial offender operating in secrecy for years. The victims were primarily women involved in vulnerable circumstances, including histories of drug use, prostitution, or economic hardship. Their disappearances had been reported to local authorities, but initial investigations failed to connect them, in part due to differences in location, reporting, and perceived risk. The West Mesa case highlighted the challenges of protecting marginalized populations, the difficulty of identifying patterns in dispersed disappearances, and the persistent danger faced by individuals on society's periphery. Investigators faced significant obstacles in determining both the identity of the perpetrator and the circumstances of the murders. The remote desert location allowed for concealment of evidence, and the passage of time complicated forensic analysis. Despite the recovery of remains, physical evidence linking the victims to a single individual was limited, leaving authorities reliant on witness testimony, missing persons reports, and the painstaking reconstruction of events to develop a coherent understanding of the crimes. The discovery prompted intense media coverage, both locally and nationally. Reports detailed the background of the victims, the unusual location of the burial site, and the ongoing challenges faced by investigators. Public attention highlighted not only the horror of the crimes, but also the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed them to occur undetected. The West Mesa case became a focal point for discussions on community safety, law enforcement effectiveness, and the societal neglect of marginalized groups. Authorities considered multiple potential suspects, reviewing connections to known offenders, criminal networks, and patterns of behavior consistent with serial killing. Several individuals were investigated in depth, though none were definitively linked to all of the murders. The case remains officially unsolved, with the perpetrator never identified, a fact that has contributed to ongoing public fascination and speculation. The victims' families were profoundly affected by the discovery. Years of uncertainty and unanswered questions were compounded by the knowledge that their loved ones had been subjected to extreme violence. The emotional toll extended beyond grief to include frustration over investigative delays and the challenges of navigating media attention. For families, the West Mesa case exemplifies both the personal and systemic consequences of unresolved crime. The investigation also illustrated broader challenges in law enforcement response. Dispersed reporting of missing individuals, combined with limited interagency coordination, contributed to delayed recognition of a pattern. The case underscores the importance of maintaining comprehensive databases, fostering communication across jurisdictions, and prioritizing investigative rigor in cases involving vulnerable populations. Lessons learned from the West Mesa case have informed subsequent efforts to improve missing persons investigations and serial offender detection. Over time, efforts to identify the perpetrator included advanced forensic techniques, geographic profiling, and examination of criminal records. Despite these resources, the desert environment, the time elapsed since the murders, and limited eyewitness accounts hindered definitive conclusions. The complexity of the case highlights the persistent challenges faced by investigators when evidence is dispersed, minimal, or intentionally concealed by a perpetrator operating with knowledge of law enforcement limitations. Public response to the West Mesa discovery emphasized both outrage and advocacy. Community members organized vigils, memorials, and initiatives to raise awareness about missing persons and the need for systemic support for vulnerable populations. The case became a symbol of the intersection between societal neglect and criminal opportunity, demonstrating how social context can influence both victimization and the ability of crimes to remain hidden. The West Mesa murders also provide insight into criminal behavior and psychology. The deliberate concealment of remains in a remote area, the targeting of marginalized individuals, and the repeated execution of the crimes over several years suggest a perpetrator with both planning and an understanding of societal blind spots. Analysts have considered motivations ranging from control and exploitation to opportunity-driven predation, reflecting the complexity of profiling offenders whose actions exploit vulnerability and anonymity. For Albuquerque, the West Mesa case represents a profound disruption to community trust. Ordinary routines, once considered safe, were revealed to be potentially hazardous, particularly for those already marginalized. The case prompted reflection on societal responsibility, law enforcement priorities, and a need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations. It serves as a reminder that crime often thrives where attention, oversight, and resources are limited, and that prevention requires both awareness and systemic commitment. Despite years of investigation, the West Mesa bone collector has not been apprehended. The mystery endures, leaving both authorities and the public with unanswered questions regarding motive, identity, and the full extent of the crimes. The case continues to be revisited by cold case units, criminal profilers, and investigative journalists, reflecting the persistent interest in understanding and resolving one of Albuquerque's most chilling unsolved crimes. In reflecting on the story, one can imagine the quiet desert landscape, the remote expanse where daily routines intersected with clandestine violence. The juxtaposition of open space and concealed crime emphasizes both the audacity of the perpetrator and the vulnerability of the victims. It also underscores the broader societal context in which such crimes can remain undetected, highlighting the interplay between environment, human behavior, and law enforcement challenges. Ultimately, the West Mesa bone collector case is defined by absence, mystery, and the enduring pursuit of justice. The story of the victims, their families, and the investigators who sought answers illustrates the complexity of modern criminal inquiry and the profound impact of unresolved crime on both personal and collective consciousness. It is a narrative shaped by ordinary life disrupted, by vulnerability exploited, and by the persistent human desire to restore order and understanding in the wake of incomprehensible violence. For those who follow the case today, it remains a study in patience, diligence, and the limitations of evidence when confronted with a perpetrator operating in secrecy. The West Mesa murders continue to resonate not for sensationalism, but for the sobering reality they reveal. That ordinary life can intersect with extraordinary danger, that vulnerability can be exploited over time, and that the quest for justice is often long, painstaking, and unresolved. Now, on to the next story. In the suburban community of Escondido, California, life in 1998 followed familiar rhythms. Streets were lined with modest homes. Children walked to school, and families navigated work, errands, and social obligations. It was a community where residents trusted their neighbors, where ordinary routines created a sense of security. Yet in March of that year, An event occurred that would disrupt this sense of safety and leave a family and town grappling with uncertainty. Stephanie Crow, a 12-year-old girl, disappeared from her home in the quiet of the night, an event that would unfold into a story marked by tragedy, misjudgment, and prolonged investigation. Stephanie lived with her family in a comfortable suburban house, characterized by care, routine, and attention. She was described as bright, responsible, and close to her siblings. On the evening of March 3rd, 1998, Stephanie's family went about their nightly routines, unaware that the events to come would irrevocably alter their lives. When it became clear that Stephanie was missing, panic set in. The family immediately contacted local authorities, initiating a search that would eventually involve multiple law enforcement agencies and attract widespread public attention. The initial investigation focused on locating the girl and understanding the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. Officers searched the neighborhood, canvassed the area, and interviewed neighbors and acquaintances. Initial findings raised questions about the possibility of abduction versus an accident or misadventure within the home. As hours passed without contact, concern intensified, and the scope of the search expanded. Law enforcement approached the case with urgency, understanding both the vulnerability of a child and the potential for criminal involvement. The case took a tragic turn when Stephanie's body was discovered in her home shortly thereafter. She had been murdered, an act that shocked both her family and the community. The crime was both violent and senseless, leaving investigators and residents struggling to comprehend the motives and circumstances that led to her death. The immediate aftermath involved an exhaustive collection of evidence, interviews with family members, and reconstruction of the timeline in an effort to identify the perpetrator. Initial suspicion fell on individuals within close proximity to the victim, a common approach in cases of familial or domestic homicide. Police considered possible motives, behavioral patterns, and access to the residence. One suspect emerged, a teenager known to have visited the home. Investigators pursued this lead based on circumstantial evidence and statements, resulting in legal proceedings that would later be recognized as flawed. The early focus of the investigation exemplified both the urgency of response and the potential for misdirection in high-profile cases. Over time, it became apparent that the initial suspect, though accused, was innocent. The wrongful accusation and subsequent prosecution highlighted the challenges of interpreting evidence, the influence of public pressure, and the consequences of investigative error. The case thus evolved not only as a story of tragedy, but also as a cautionary example of how assumptions and circumstantial evidence can mislead even experienced professionals. It underscored the complexity of criminal investigation, particularly in cases involving children, and the necessity for thorough, methodical analysis. The eventual identification of the true perpetrator came through renewed investigative efforts, revisiting evidence and considering alternative scenarios. Forensic analysis, careful reconstruction of events, and attention to behavioral patterns ultimately led authorities to an individual outside the immediate circle of family and acquaintances. The resolution, while providing some closure, could not erase the years of uncertainty, the emotional strain on the family, or the broader lessons learned from investigative missteps. For the community of Escondido, Stephanie Crow's murder represented a profound breach of safety. Residents were forced to confront the reality that danger could exist even in ordinary, familiar environments. The case prompted discussions about child safety, neighborhood vigilance, and the responsibility of both individuals and law enforcement to respond effectively to potential threats. It illustrated the delicate balance between trust in community and the recognition of potential risk. The psychological impact on the family was extensive and enduring. The loss of Stephanie, compounded by the wrongful accusation of an innocent party, created layers of grief, anger, and frustration. The family navigated public scrutiny, legal proceedings, and ongoing investigation while attempting to preserve their lives and community relationships. Their experience underscores the multifaceted effects of violent crime, extending beyond immediate loss to encompass social, emotional, and legal challenges. Media coverage played a significant role in shaping public perception of the case. News outlets reported on the disappearance, the search efforts, and the subsequent investigation. Early narratives focused on the initial suspect, influencing both public opinion and community sentiment. As the case evolved, coverage highlighted the eventual identification of the true perpetrator and reflected on the consequences of investigative misjudgment. The interplay between media attention, public interest, and investigative process demonstrates the complex environment in which high-profile cases unfold. Stephanie Crow's story also illustrates broader themes relevant to child safety and criminal investigation. It emphasizes the importance of evidence-based inquiry, the need for restraint in forming conclusions, and the potential for misinterpretation in emotionally charged circumstances. The case serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the persistent dedication required in solving crimes involving vulnerable populations. In reflecting on the events of March 1998, one can imagine the quiet suburban streets of Escondido, the routine of household life, and the sudden intrusion of tragedy. The ordinary rhythms of daily life were disrupted in a single moment, leaving lasting consequences for family, community, and investigators. The narrative underscores how violence can intersect with the seemingly mundane, creating ripples that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances. Ultimately, the murder of Stephanie Crow remains a story of loss, perseverance, and the pursuit of justice. While the eventual identification of the perpetrator provided some resolution, the emotional and social ramifications endure. The case continues to inform both investigative practice and community awareness, serving as a reminder of the importance of careful, methodical inquiry and the vulnerabilities inherent in everyday life. It is a story defined by absence, by the challenges of understanding human behavior, and by the enduring desire to protect the most vulnerable members of society. For those who study the case, Stephanie Crow's story provides insight into both human tragedy and investigative process. It emphasizes the delicate balance between urgency and accuracy, the impact of assumptions, and the necessity of perseverance in uncovering truth. While the circumstances are tragic, the lessons derived from the case contribute to broader understanding, reinforcing the importance of vigilance, care, and methodical inquiry in preventing and resolving crime. In quiet reflection, the story of Stephanie Crow lingers. It is a narrative of ordinary life interrupted, of vulnerability exposed, and of the enduring quest for justice. The calm of suburban streets, the rhythms of family life, and the presence of a community dedicated to protection stand in stark contrast to the abrupt and violent intrusion that mark her final moments. The case endures, both as a memorial to Stephanie and as a lesson in the complexities of understanding crime, human behavior, and the pursuit of resolution in the face of tragedy. Now, on to the next story. Between 1996 and the early 2010s, the quiet stretches of Long Island, New York, became the site of a chilling and unresolved criminal mystery. Bodies of women began appearing along remote beaches and wooded areas near Gilgo Beach and Jones Beach, revealing the work of an individual later known as the Long Island serial killer. The case is characterized not only by the number of victims, but by the calculated methods of disposal, the long period over which the crimes occurred, and the difficulty investigators faced in identifying a perpetrator. The known victims were largely women involved in sex work, many of whom advertised their services online. Their lives were ordinary and precarious, often intersecting with the urban environment of New York City while remaining isolated in their personal routines. The first public discovery of remains occurred in December 2010, when a passerby stumbled across a human torso on a remote section of Gilgo Beach. Further searches soon revealed additional remains, leading law enforcement to recognize a disturbing pattern. Multiple victims had been killed and disposed of in similar locations, suggesting a single perpetrator. Over the following months, police discovered a series of remains along a 12-mile stretch of coastline, both buried and partially exposed. Investigators confirmed at least 10 victims, though there is speculation that more individuals were killed and not yet identified. The method of killing and disposal indicated careful planning. Bodies were often dismembered and placed in garbage bags, with some evidence suggesting they were wrapped or weighted to prevent discovery. These methods pointed to a perpetrator who understood both forensic limitations and the geography of Long Island's remote areas. The investigation was complicated by the transient and marginalized status of many victims. Because some were involved in sex work, regular reporting to authorities was inconsistent, and their disappearances were not always immediately noticed. This delay created challenges in establishing timelines and linking cases. Authorities had to rely on a combination of missing persons reports, forensic evidence, and online activity to begin constructing a profile of the killer and understanding patterns of movement. Law enforcement launched an intensive investigation, combining local police, the Suffolk County Police Department, and federal agencies, including the FBI. Crime scene analysis, forensic anthropology, and geographic profiling were employed in an effort to identify connections between the victims and the locations where remains were found. Investigators examined online advertisements, communication histories, and social contacts to trace the final known movements of each woman. Despite these efforts, the killer remained elusive, and the case became a textbook example of the difficulties posed by a mobile and meticulous perpetrator. Public attention intensified as media coverage highlighted both the brutality of the crimes and the gaps in understanding the killer's identity. Journalists and true crime enthusiasts noted the challenges posed by the nature of the victims' lives, the span of time over which the murders occurred, and the careful disposal of remains. For the families of the victims, the prolonged investigation compounded grief with frustration and uncertainty. Many have publicly expressed the difficulty of seeking justice when the perpetrator remains unidentified and the details of the deaths are only partially known. In the years following the initial discoveries, investigators uncovered further evidence linking multiple victims to a single offender. Digital evidence, including tracking online communications and financial records, suggested connections between some victims and provided potential insight into how the killer selected targets. However, the perpetrator's ability to remain undetected for over a decade highlighted both the ingenuity and patience involved in the crimes. The geographical patterns of disposal also indicate knowledge of Long Island's beaches, marshlands, and wooded areas, allowing the killer to avoid detection while maintaining proximity to urban centers. Several persons of interest have been questioned over the years. Some were initially suspected due to proximity, criminal records, or behavior patterns. Others were linked through circumstantial evidence or forensic traces. Yet, no one has been conclusively charged in connection with the series of murders. The lack of definitive leads underscores the challenges of solving crimes that combine elements of mobility, victim vulnerability, and careful concealment. The Long Island serial killer case is also notable for the psychological dimensions of both perpetrator and victims. The killer exhibited careful planning, patience, and awareness of investigative methods, suggesting a high level of sophistication. Conversely, the victims' lives reflected the precariousness faced by marginalized individuals, whose disappearances may not immediately trigger widespread alarm. This dynamic created conditions under which the perpetrator could operate for years without detection, emphasizing the interplay between opportunity, vulnerability, and criminal strategy. For the broader community, the case has introduced a persistent awareness of risk and the limits of safety. Residents of Long Island, especially those near the beaches and wooded areas where remains were found, were confronted with the reality that a serial offender could act undetected for years. The case challenged assumptions about visibility, security, and the reliability of community oversight, creating a sense of both fear and fascination that continues to draw public and media attention. Efforts to resolve the case continue to this day. Advances in DNA analysis, forensic genealogy, and digital investigation provide potential avenues for breakthroughs. Law enforcement has maintained an open case file, revisiting leads and reanalyzing evidence as technology advances. Despite decades of investigation, the Long Island serial killer remains unidentified, a reminder of both the limitations of criminal detection and the persistence of carefully executed crimes. The enduring interest in the case also stems from the human dimension. Each victim represents an individual life cut short, with family, friends, and communities left with questions and grief. True crime discussions emphasize not only the procedural challenges, but also the societal context, highlighting how vulnerability, opportunity, and planning intersect in the commission of crimes. The Long Island serial killer case is a study in both human behavior and investigative challenge, illustrating the ways in which crime can persist beyond conventional detection and resolution. For observers, the story of Gilgo Beach is a reminder that even in heavily populated regions, spaces exist where crime can go unnoticed, and that meticulous planning and understanding of environment can allow an offender to evade law enforcement for years. The case combines elements of geography, psychology, technology, and social context, making it both complex and compelling as a narrative of unresolved criminal activity. Ultimately, the Long Island serial killer remains a symbol of the intersection between methodical criminal behavior and the vulnerabilities inherent in modern society. The discovery of remains along the beaches of Long Island revealed both the capability of the perpetrator and the challenges faced by investigators. While forensic advancements continue to offer hope for identification and justice, the case remains unsolved, leaving questions about motive, identity, and scope unanswered. The Gilgo Beach investigation endures, a quiet reminder of the persistent uncertainty that can accompany serial crime. It is a case defined by careful concealment, long-term planning, and the resilience of those seeking answers in the face of ambiguity. For the victims and their families, the story is one of loss and incomplete understanding. For investigators and the public, it is a case that challenges assumptions about visibility, risk, and the ability to reconcile meticulous criminal acts with limited evidence. Now, on to the next story. In the late 1980s, the city of Hayward, California, carried the quiet energy of suburban life. Children played in yards, streets were traversed by school buses and neighborhood cars, and daily routines gave a sense of order and predictability. On the morning of November 19, 1988, Michaela Garrick, a 9-year-old girl, followed her usual routine, enjoying the simple freedoms of childhood. That day, however, would mark the beginning of a story that has remained unresolved for decades, capturing attention through its mystery and the enduring uncertainty surrounding her fate. Michaela was known in her community as a bright and friendly child. She had a lively curiosity, a love for friends and family, and a demeanor that reflected the typical innocence of her age. On the day of her disappearance, she accompanied a friend to a nearby convenience store, a short distance from her home. The outing was intended to be brief, a casual errand that she had likely undertaken many times. Yet as she and her friend approached the store, an event occurred that would forever alter the trajectory of her life and the lives of those around her. Witnesses later reported seeing Michaela near the store, interacting with an unidentified man who appeared to be engaging her in conversation. The exact nature of this encounter remains unclear, though it culminated in her sudden disappearance. Her friend, witnessing the event but unable to intervene, reported the incident immediately, prompting local authorities to begin a search and investigation. The abruptness of her disappearance created shock and alarm in the community, highlighting the vulnerability of children even in seemingly safe suburban environments. Local law enforcement responded quickly, conducting searches of nearby streets, wooded areas, and residential zones. Flyers and public announcements were distributed, encouraging anyone with information to come forward. Despite immediate action, initial leads were scarce, and Michaela's location remained unknown. The combination of a densely populated urban-suburban environment and the fleeting nature of eyewitness information complicated investigative efforts. Each passing hour emphasized both the urgency and the complexity inherent in cases involving missing children. As the investigation progressed, authorities explored multiple avenues. They examined potential suspects, reviewed prior reports of criminal activity in the area, and considered both opportunistic and targeted abduction scenarios. Investigators interviewed neighbors, store employees, and community members, attempting to reconstruct Michaela's final movements. The early hours of an abduction are often critical in missing child cases. Yet in Michaela's case, the absence of immediate, actionable evidence made the reconstruction of events particularly challenging. The disappearance drew attention from both local and national media, highlighting the risks facing children and the necessity of vigilance in everyday life. Public awareness campaigns sought to generate leads, appealing to the community's collective knowledge and attention. Families in the region were reminded of the importance of supervision, neighborhood cooperation, and proactive safety measures, emphasizing how ordinary routines can be disrupted in unexpected ways. Over time, several persons of interest were identified, though no definitive conclusions could be drawn from the initial investigation. Authorities continued to analyze physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and behavioral patterns in an effort to trace Michaela's movements. The prolonged nature of the case underscored the challenges investigators face when early leads fail to produce tangible results and when the environment allows for rapid concealment of potential evidence. The case of Michaela Garrick also illustrates broader societal concerns. Abductions, particularly of children, underscore the need for vigilance, the importance of community awareness, and the necessity of rapid and coordinated investigative responses. The emotional impact on families, neighbors, and communities is profound, as the absence of closure creates enduring uncertainty and grief. Michaela's family, in particular, maintained a continuous effort to keep her story alive, advocating for renewed investigations, public attention, and technological application to the case over the ensuing decades. Despite the passage of time, the investigation did not cease. Cold case strategies were applied, including renewed witness interviews, examination of new tips, and technological advancements such as DNA analysis and digital databases. Investigators recognized that the passage of years could allow new information to surface, whether through changes in personal relationships, shifts in behavior, or emerging forensic techniques. This long-term persistence reflects the dedication required in complex missing child cases and the ongoing hope for resolution. Michaela Garrick's story exemplifies the unpredictability of human behavior and circumstance. The ordinary activities of a young child, combined with brief interactions in public spaces, can unexpectedly result in long-term mystery. The case highlights both the vulnerability of youth and the importance of environmental awareness, illustrating how even familiar routines may conceal potential danger. The community's response, both initially and over time, demonstrates the capacity for collective action in pursuit of safety, justice, and resolution. Reflecting on Michaela's disappearance, one can imagine the streets of Hayward in November 1988. The crisp air, the sidewalks lined with homes, and the seemingly mundane rhythms of suburban life. The stark contrast between ordinary daily activity and the sudden, unexplained absence of a child emphasizes both the fragility of safety and the enduring emotional impact of unresolved events. Michaela's story continues to resonate, highlighting the delicate balance between normalcy and unforeseen disruption. Now, on to the next story.